This week on Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, guest host David Horton of Radford University in Virginia welcomes the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, to the program to talk about what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they designed the American system of elections. Why did the Founders give 2 senators to each state? How was the controversy between big states and little states resolved, and how has it influenced American history? What was the original purpose of the Electoral College? To what extent should the Electoral College mirror the popular vote? What was the impact of the odious 3/5 clause on early American elections, including Jefferson's election in 1800? Why did Jefferson argue for tearing up the Constitution once per generation, perhaps every 19 years? How important was slavery to the debates in Philadelphia in 1787? And were the Founders really opposed to democracy? All of this and more on this week's Listening to America.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton in Radford, Virginia, serving as your guest co-host today. And joining me for this edition of Listening to America is the third President of the United States of America, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Mr. President, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Good day to you, citizen.
We are at an interesting point in our political lives as we're in the middle of a very contentious presidential election here in 2024. And I thought it might make a lot of sense for us to go back and take a look at our representative republic, how we got to the level of representation that we have, to take a look at the Electoral College and why that is the way we elect a president and how that is decided here in this country. Mr. President, back when the country was first established, as a Virginian, I look at this very fondly because Virginia was the largest state. Virginia was, in many ways, the most powerful state, and that informed the entire process as we looked at a system of representation for our legislature. Could you speak about the initial elements of the Constitutional Convention and perhaps where your protege, Mr. Madison, made a very powerful argument for how we should move forward?
Yes, thank you. So I should say, first of all, that I was not at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. I was in France, serving as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI. And so I wasn't there. John Adams wasn't there. Patrick Henry wasn't there. So a number of people of some importance to the founding of this country were absent from that deliberation. If I had been in this country, I wonder whether I would have agreed to sit at the convention. I'm a very private man, and I prefer to work from behind the scenes in my study at Monticello, and then to have discussions with my closest friend, James Madison, and he would carry my ideas, perhaps, or a draft of my suggestions with him to Philadelphia. But I sometimes wonder whether I would have agreed to sit on that in the Virginia delegation. Mr. Madison, bless him, was really the father of the United States Constitution and the author of what came afterwards, the Bill of Rights. He studied hard to prepare. In fact, he wrote to me in France and said, Mr. Jefferson, we're on new ground here. This is unprecedented in human history, what we're about to try to do. How shall I prepare? And I answered in the way that I answer most questions: read books. And so I gathered about 80 books for him in my wanderings around the book-stalls of Paris and sent them over to him. And amazingly, Mr. Madison read them all. And he took extensive notes. He digested them. And then he wrote a couple of essays about the flaws of constitutions and the weaknesses of our system and so on. And so by the time he got to Philadelphia in May of 1787, he was without doubt the best prepared person there by magnitudes. And that meant that he had a command over the deliberations that Virginia might not have had if it had just shown up, as, for example, the governor of the state, Edmund Randolph, did. And so all praise to James Madison. And he then, through Randolph, the governor of Virginia, presented what's known as the Virginia Plan, which called for a strong national government. There would be either a single house in Congress, or if there were more than one house, it would still work by way of proportional representation. And so on the first days of the convention, Randolph stood up and presented the Virginia Plan. And although there was an immediate reaction to that, the Virginia plan nevertheless percolated through all that followed. And so I think it's important to say that we owe just an enormous amount of respect and praise to my closest friend, James Madison. But his plan would have been proportional in Congress. A number of the smaller states and southern states were terrified by that idea. The smaller states because they felt that they were already small in geography and small in population, and they would simply be swallowed up by a strong new national government. And the southern states, particularly South Carolina, terrified because they feared that a strong national government would begin to meddle with their favorite institution, slavery. And so there was an intense debate over this, particularly led by the small states, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland. Rhode Island wasn't there. They refused to participate, but they were still in the conversation. And the small states balked and said they simply weren't going to agree to anything that didn't enshrine equality of representation by state, which, by the way, was the system under the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles, states voted, not individual representatives. And so that was the insistence of New Jersey and other small states. And eventually, as I think you know, something called the Great Compromise occurred in late June of 1787, in which the mechanism that we all know today was agreed to, that every state would have 2 senators, irrespective of geographical size and irrespective of population. And every state would have proportional representation with respect to the House of Representatives. So there would be proportional representation in the more popular House. There would be state representation in the Senate. And I should say that at that time, senators were elected by legislatures, by state legislatures, not through the popular vote. It took an amendment in the 20th century.
And so with that, Mr. President, as we have evolved this system and look to determine representation, can we talk a little bit about how this compromise has affected political outcomes in this nation and how we have moved forward with one House that is popularly elected and one House that is equal representation?
From the point of view of pure democratic theory, it doesn't make much sense for every state to have 2 senators, given the differential in population in your time, which is much more pronounced than it was in mine. But this is how compromise works. There would have been no Constitution without the Great Compromise. Frankly, there would have been no Constitution without a significant set of compromises on slavery, too. Perhaps we can talk about that a little bit later. But it was clear by mid-June that New Jersey and other small states would simply walk away, and that would force us to revert to the Articles of Confederation, which were highly inefficient and needed desperately to be reformed. They would not agree to the Virginia plan, which would have made the national legislature proportional in nature. I understand this, and I also am an advocate of states' rights. I think the most important amendment of the Bill of Rights is the 10th, which says those powers not delegated to the national authority belong instead to the states and to the people. And so as a believer in state sovereignty, I always called myself a Virginian first and an American second. My country was Virginia. Because of that, I believe that the states do need special protection under the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton gave a famous speech in June of 1787 for 5 hours at the Constitutional Convention. Mr. Madison took down essentially verbatim notes of the entire proceedings. And again, we owe an enormous debt of respect to Mr. Madison for doing that. There was no transcript. There were no court reporters. And Hamilton gave this 5-hour speech in which he said the president should serve for life and senators should serve for life and governors should be appointed by the national executive and the veto power of the president should be unqualified. The national government should be able to veto any act of any state and so on. So it was clear what the High Federalists wanted, which was to create a powerful, commercially based, war-loving, centralized national authority, and that would have eroded the sovereignty of my country, Virginia, or somebody else's, New Hampshire. And so the small states really took a stand on this question, and in the end, the Great Compromise served everyone's interests. So in your time, the House is proportional. And therefore, big states like New York or Pennsylvania or Virginia get more representatives than small states like, say, Wyoming or Alaska. But in the Senate, every state gets fully 2 U.S. senators, and that means that the state sovereignty, although eroded by the demographic dynamics and the industrial and economic dynamics of modernity, although eroded, those states still have a very significant sovereign place under the U.S. Constitution.
And with that, we've established representation with the Great Compromise. Can you speak a little bit about your thoughts and some of the other founders' thoughts of the legislature versus the executive in the initial concept of the Constitution?
Yes, thanks for asking that. It's a really important question. So I wrote about this. I said when I read the Constitution, and by the way, there was a pact of secrecy. Nobody knew what they had done until afterwards. When I finally got copies in Paris, I read the new Constitution with great interest and scrutiny, and there were a number of things that I powerfully disliked about it. But I did actually say that I liked the ingenious compromise between small states and large. And I also said that the executive, with the powers enumerated in the second article of the Constitution, was at the time a responsible and limited office. But I said over time, crises and wars and economic downturns and so on will lead the executive to have more and more and more authority until he becomes something like an elected monarch, and that we must really be cautious about this, that the time will come when we give the executive far too much authority, and he will claim that he has no choice because of emergencies or exigencies or whatever, and that this will then essentially re-enslave us to the very form of monarchy that we fought to get rid of. And so, as president, the third president, I read my authority very minimally. I was a quiet administrative president. I did not attempt to aggrandize myself in any way and to take on authority that the Constitution does not grant to the President of the United States. And I believe that Mr. Madison followed the same approach, and so did James Monroe. I served 2 terms, Madison 2, and then Monroe 2. We 3 Virginians, as you well know, created something called the Virginia Dynasty, which governed the country through 24 years, which was essential to a responsible government under the Constitution of the United States. But I knew that some ruthless demagogue might become president. Somebody who did not have respect for these restraints and norms might become president. And when that happened, those powers will be assumed by the executive. And once the power is assumed, it never tends to go back. And so over time, I predicted that unless we had constitutional revision every 18 or 19 years, that we would evolve into something like a constitutional monarchy.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your thoughts. We need to take a quick break right now, but when we come back, I'd like to talk about the election of a president and how the system we've discussed thus far really set us up for the system that we experience today. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton here in Radford, Virginia, serving as guest co-host this week. And joining me this week is the third president of the United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Mr. President, thank you again for spending time with us today. And in our first segment, we talked a lot about representation, how the legislature would be established in this country during the Constitutional Convention. What I'd like to do, if we may, is talk about the election of a president and how this process worked. And as we get into this topic, certainly understanding the way representation was determined is an important element as we talk about how a president was to be elected. But there's a complicated subject that I think we have to get to, and I understand how difficult this is to address. Slavery was an integral part of this discussion because obviously in the South, you had slaves living throughout the southern states, and that a choice on whether or not to allow slave voices to count or to allow the population to count, however that was wielded, was certainly an issue that some states like South Carolina and other small southern states were very concerned that their political power might be usurped should the number of people living in the South not fully count in some way, shape, or form? Mr. President, to get to the question, can you talk a little bit about some of the decisions made toward electing a president, why we have the process that we have today that includes a popular vote that leads to an electoral college, and then the issue of slavery that is mixed within that? And I know that's a great deal to consider, but your opinion on this would be so welcomed.
Thank you. Let me try to sort this out as clearly as I can. I should say two things to start. First of all, I was a slaveholder. I owned as many as 200 slaves at any given time. I was one of the larger slaveholders in the state of Virginia, and I was a slaveholder all of my life. I freed 8 slaves, 3 during my lifetime and 5 at the time of my death in 1826. And so I must simply make sure everyone is aware of that from the start. But secondly, I am a principled opponent of slavery and tried in many different ways to get us to extricate ourselves from that odious and abominable institution, which I regard as a violation of natural law. My point is, I was a slaveholder, and secondly, that I believe that slavery is incompatible, fundamentally incompatible, with the principles of the United States and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Having said that, I will tell you that several southern states, and especially South Carolina, made it clear from the beginning in Philadelphia that they would not sign on to any instrument, any constitution that did not protect that species of property, as they called it. In other words, if there had been any attempt to outlaw slavery, or to outlaw the slave trade, or to tax slavery at some level, any federal intrusion into the institution of slavery where it existed, and of course it was in the southern states, but not just in the southern states at the time, that would be a deal breaker, as you like to say, and South Carolina would walk away and there would be no constitution. I can't tell you how vociferously South Carolina made this argument. In other words, they held the whole process hostage and said there is one absolute that you must not touch, and that is the institution of slavery. Several of the Northerners, especially Gouverneur Morris of New York and Pennsylvania, were so appalled by that they were tempted to let South Carolina and other states go. But in the end, good sense prevailed because we needed to be a unified nation, and a series of very unfortunate but necessary compromises were made. And one of them, of course, is the 3/5 clause. Let me try to explain. The 3/5 clause means that for every 5 African American enslaved people in southern states, 3 will be counted for the purposes of proportion and representation. They would not have a voice. They would not vote. They would not be listened to in any public deliberations. They were slaves. But they would be counted, 3 for every 5, for the purposes of proportion and representation. So partly this was just a simple and ugly mechanism to maintain the power of the southern states because they feared the growing northern population would finally overwhelm them and begin to meddle with slavery. But it also, there was a less ugly side to it too, sir, and that was that if you have a population, say, of 2 million people, in which 500,000 or more are slaves in Virginia or North Carolina, there still are infrastructural needs. They're still part of the economy. They're generating wealth. There is a sense in which they are part of the larger population, and even though they are not enfranchised, they still put burdens on the state that have to be paid for in roads and bridges and so on. And so the notion was that the South should be awarded for this larger population, but not too much. And so a number of formulas were debated. The 3/5 idea had already existed prior to the Constitutional Convention, and that compromise was eventually worked out. And so when I was elected to the presidency, for example, in 1800, Northern Federalist newspapers and pastors jeered that I was a Negro president because they said I probably would not have won the election of 1800 without the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. Now, Keep in mind, sir, that in this era, women didn't vote, poor white people didn't vote, free black people didn't vote, Native Americans, Indians didn't vote. They weren't considered citizens because they were from separate nations. So the electors, the people that were the citizens who actually voted or could hold public office in my time, were white men of considerable property. So that's the 3/5 clause.
And thank you, sir. That helps us understand a little bit more about establishing this count, establishing this population, looking at these numbers. And I think that helps inform us when we start going to how a president would be elected when there were, as you said, only so many people who could vote. It didn't necessarily mean that their votes were specifically for a president. The concept of an electoral college was brought up. Could you address that just a little bit for us and why that concept was chosen to create the process that we have today, where people don't directly elect a president, but they elect a slate of electors from their state that then go forward to make the decision about who should be president? Sir, could you help us understand that further?
Yes, and again, I'd like to preface my remarks by saying that I advocated in a letter to Mr. Madison from Paris in 1787 that we tear up the Constitution once every generation, about once every 19 years, and begin again, so that the Constitution doesn't become a kind of fossil. I said we may as well require the man to wear the coat that fitted him as a child as to remain under the regimen of our barbarous earlier constitutional provisions. And so it's important, I think, that everyone understand that I am a believer in quite frequent adjustments and even rewritings of the U.S. Constitution. But the Electoral College has two purposes, as seen in Philadelphia. The first one is logistical. This is a time when there was almost no infrastructure in the country. There were very few roads. There wasn't a paved road in the state of Virginia at the time of my death. There was no way that you could have an election of the kind you have in your time, where on a certain day in November, everyone votes and that those votes are tabulated more or less instantly, and you can determine who the president is. So the logistical problem was addressed by the Electoral College, that such people as were entitled to vote would vote in their states. Those votes would be tallied. Then electors from that state would come to Washington or Philadelphia, wherever the capital happened to be, or send in their results so that we could coordinate this and make it efficient. And it would have been extremely inefficient to try to gather all of the votes, given the weaknesses of the postal system and the weaknesses of our infrastructure in the 1780s and 90s. So that's one reason. The more important reason for the Electoral College was that the people who met in Philadelphia were not very enamored of the idea of democracy. They did not believe that the people were wise, that they don't really understand what's at stake, that they are capable of being swept away by demagogues or popular whims. They're volatile, and that if we just allowed the people to govern themselves, they might make a mess of it. And so the notion was that, yes, because we were a budding democracy, we called ourselves a republic, of course, that the people would vote, by which I mean white males of a certain property base, about 10% of the population. The Electoral College would gather, and they would have it in their power to either certify what the people had done, which they normally would do, or they could veto what the people had done if they believed that the people had made it an irresponsible or dangerous choice. As a practical matter, the Electoral College has never really stepped between the people and their choice, and in your time there are laws in almost every state that require the electors to vote for the person who won the election in that state.
Well, sir, that brings us to an interesting place, and something that I'd hoped for us to be able to get to is how the voices of the people are represented in our modern time, and of course during your time, with the way we decided on the proportional representation in the House, the equal representation in the Senate, and came up with a number of total representatives, total electors that would be divided among the states, where each state would have at least 2 electors, and then some states would have 1, some states could have as many as 20 or more electors based on their population. How that impacts the voice of each individual voter. when it comes time to actually add up the total and see who can get to a majority to become president. Mr. President, can we speak to that just a little bit about how some votes in some ways can count a little bit more than other votes based on that equal representation, and how that looks in the modern era?
I know that there are advocates in your time for the continuation of the Electoral College. I probably would not be one of them unless the Electoral College did have the authority to override the will of the people in certain extreme situations. Let's say the people voted for someone who was a hardened criminal or a known demagogue. The Electoral College originally was designed to be able to prevent that. And since now the Electoral College merely certifies what is already accomplished through the popular vote, its usefulness would appear to be small, and maybe it's time to get rid of it altogether. I should just slightly correct what you said. Each state is entitled to at least 3 electors. If you have a single representative in Congress, as some states do, in your time, say Wyoming and North Dakota and Alaska, they join 2 other electors who represent the Senate. And so Alaska would have 3 electors and North Dakota would have 3 electors and so on. A state like, in your time, California, that has 45 million people would have a very large number of electors, but 2 of them would be representing the 2 senators from that state. So that's the way the system was set up. And in your time, it has the effect of essentially being a rubber stamp. I should say, however, the Constitution enables any state to determine its electors in any way that it wishes. In other words, there's no systematic and uniform way of determining who the electors are in any given state. Each state has a large grant of freedom to decide how it wants to create its elector base. And so in the early days, legislatures would do it in states like New York or elsewhere. In some states, it would be done by another mechanism. But this is one of the sort of the loose ends of the original Constitution that could create mischief in your time, because it is possible, for example, let's just take a state at random, for Oklahoma to, through its legislative process, to say, we're going to select electors in the following way. And if they did so, that might not certify the popular vote. Probably it would, but there are loopholes and a certain vagueness in the Electoral College articles of the Constitution that would enable mischief under certain circumstances. So in your time, there's a much more uniform approach to this than there was in mine, but it is not rock solid, and the Constitution is pretty strong on this question. And that means that it would be almost impossible in your time. It would take an emphatic constitutional amendment to change that formula. So in a certain sense, as long as you don't follow my advice and tear up the Constitution every generation, you're stuck with it.
And I think that presents its own set of challenges as well, because 5 times in our nation's history, we've had popular vote winners who did not win the Electoral College, and that's happened twice in the last 25 years. So that is not necessarily representing the will of the total people. It certainly represents the will of the state, perhaps, and that can be debatable. But could you address that, where we've had 5 instances out of 46 presidents that the popular vote has not resulted in that person ascending to the presidency?
I can say this much about it. We can have a rational discussion about it, or we can have a constitutional discussion. Let's begin with the constitutional discussion. The Founding Fathers did not believe in democracy. They often equated it with mobocracy, and they honestly believed that the people were not up to the challenge of governing themselves. And that's why the Senate is created under different systems from the House, and why the Senate serves for 6 years and the House for 2, and so on. The idea was to find different ways to filter the will of the people, and also to restrain the will of the people so that nothing could get done in a kind of volatile moment, say a war scare or an economic collapse, where the people would demand a cessation of taxes or want to break down the First Amendment and censor freedom of expression or freedom of religion. The Founding Fathers created a constitution that resisted the direct will of the people. That's my point. And therefore, they put in mechanisms to prevent the people from having their will in a direct way. And so even though the popular vote may be X, and that would suggest that one candidate won and the other one clearly lost in the popular vote, that's not the way our system works. Our system then turns to the Electoral College, and that's the only way you can become the president of the United States, unless there's a crisis and it's thrown into the House of Representatives. And so that's just the rule of the game. And it may seem illiberal and undemocratic in your time, but that's the system that the founders created, and you're stuck with it unless you amend or tear up the Constitution. Let me provide just an analogy. If you play chess, the knight can only move in a certain way. And you can't say in the middle of the game, I don't think that's really fair. I think the knight should be able to move in 3 or 4 different ways. That's not the rules of chess. And the rules of our Constitution are that the people vote state by state. Electors are chosen by the states. It takes a majority in the Electoral College to become president of the United States. And it doesn't matter in some sense if the loser had 10 more popular votes than the winner or 5 million more popular votes than the winner. And so you're stuck with this. There's no way around this short of a constitutional revision. And I think that this is something you might want to address. But the most important thing that people can hear from our discussion about this is that the founding fathers did not believe in direct democracy. I probably came closest among them to that idea. But even I felt that the first secretion of the will of the people is not always a distinguished one. And that's why the Senate provides a check against the more volatile House of Representatives. And so the idea of a filtering republic is really the key to American constitutional democracy. And your sort of popular notion that the democracy should prevail in every instance and the popular vote really should be certified is not what the founders intended. And so if you don't like that, the only thing you can do about it is to demand an amendment.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your thoughts, for enlightening us and helping us to work through a very complicated issue and to understand where it came from. We do need to take a break, but when we return, we'll talk with Clay Jenkinson and reflect on electing a president. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson.
Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I've taken off my wig and tights here, and I've returned to my life as a mild-mannered humanities scholar. And sitting across from me virtually is my friend David Horton at Radford University in Virginia. I've traveled there on a number of occasions and am eager to do so more. David, thank you very much for today.
Thank you, sir. I think this has been a great discussion with Mr. Jefferson because I so often hear people trying to understand why we have the system the way we have it to elect a president. Most people forget about the electors or only understand it when it's talked about in terms of swing states, the difference that it makes for the election to really be decided by a small number of states, a small number of people, ultimately here in this country. I think Mr. Jefferson helped us understand why we have the system and how we got to where we are. But maybe you and I could talk a little bit about the impact of that system and what it has meant in practice as opposed to theory.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, David. So a couple of quick things. Number one, just to reiterate, the Founding Fathers were 55 white men. There were no women at the Constitutional Convention. There were no black people, free or enslaved. There were no Muslims. This was a conclave of the privileged establishment white male class of America at the time. Today, if you had a new constitutional convention, it would be impossible to consider having that sort of a limited group of constitution makers. Secondly, slavery has been part of American life from the beginning. When I've been teaching these online courses, which people should take a look at, they can go to our website, listeningtoamerica.org. I've done a number of them, David, on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and I'm going to be doing a couple later this year on what a new Constitution would have to address if we had another constitutional convention, which most people say, God forbid. But leaving that aside for the moment, slavery has been central. And the Founding Fathers really, truly were held hostage by the Carolinas, especially South Carolina. And we've, in a certain sense, been held hostage, my friend, ever since. that this is one of the main problems of American life, that we've had to share our constitutional system with two races, at least two, and the founding fathers were not willing to do that. They regarded African Americans as other, and they had no intention of liberating them or counting them. And so the Three-Fifths Clause is just kind of an ugly, even disgusting fossil of that era. But there are other problems, and the Electoral College, in some sense, was designed to reinforce all of that too. And the southern states wanted 2 senators in every state because that would help them to protect what they called their peculiar institution from proportional representation that might occur as the northern states grew in population. And that's exactly what happened. The southern senators have held up equal rights for African Americans and others, but especially African Americans, from the beginning until today. And a lot of people like to say, well, there's the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the post-Civil War period, or there's the civil rights activity of the 1950s and 60s, even into the 1970s. But the simple fact is that even now, hatred, race prejudice, has been protected by the formulae that were set up by the founding fathers in 1787. And that's an unhappy fact, David, but it's one that can't be denied. And if you add to that something that did not come up in the program, because it wasn't there when Jefferson was alive, the idea of 60 votes being required in the Senate to do any major thing, the notion of cloture, is not in the Constitution. The Constitution intended both houses to work by simple majority rule, except with on treaties and so on. The idea that it takes 60 votes to clear any significant piece of legislation is just a habit, a norm that was established in the United States Senate. It's anti-democratic, because if you think that small states like North Dakota, Wyoming, and Alaska, and Vermont already have an outsized power in the Senate, North Dakota, for example, 760,000 people, 2 senators, California, 48 million people, 2 senators, nobody can really justify that in constitutional theory anymore. It's just a fossil of what happened. But if you add that, that's power that comes to the small rural states. So most of the states that have 2 senators and tiny populations are red states, highly conservative states, in some cases bigoted states. They have so much power, as much power in Wyoming in the Senate as California or Illinois or Florida or Texas or New York or Pennsylvania. That in itself is troubling. If you add to that the cloture idea that 60 votes must occur in order to clear an important piece of legislation from the Senate, that gives those small states even more power than they otherwise would have. So there's a reform worth taking a look at. Most Americans today are just puzzled by all of this. They don't spend a lot of time reading and studying about the Constitution, nor perhaps should they. But I've given a lot of time to this, and I know you do too. And it really does create some troubling issues. So let me just suggest one. Something that could happen in a few weeks. Because each state is allowed to determine its electors in any way that it wishes, it's possible that between now and the certification of the next president, whoever it should be, state legislatures will try to mess around with this. If we had a uniform electoral system in the country, that is a national law requiring uniformity in the way that electors were chosen and how they operated in every state, and how elections are certified in every state, I believe vitally needed election reform, this problem would go away, or nearly so. But if you allow 50 states to have 50 different ways to do this, and there are people that don't want to let the popular vote prevail, there are opportunities for mischief, and I predict that we are going to see a fair amount of that between now and January 20th, 2025. This is a problem that has to be addressed. And, there was an electoral reform, a certification reform act passed after the debacle of January 6th, and it helps some. It helps in the certification of the election in the United States Congress. But it doesn't particularly address the problem of rogue states doing rogue things with their electors and their own internal certifications. And so that is something that a reasonable country would want to address.
Yes, sir. And that's the question. How do you address that? How do you make this work? We talked with Mr. Jefferson about how we got to the system we have, but how do you get to another system? And one of the pieces I had hoped we could talk about a little bit is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which has come to more and more prominence in each election over the last 10 or so years, as we have continued to see some of these challenges take place, where there's an agreement among the states that the U.S. states and the District of Columbia award all of their electoral votes to whichever ticket wins the overall popular vote in the 50 states. And so far, a number of states have agreed to it. Typically, they tend to be bluer states in the terms of the in terms of political affiliation. They tend to be a little more Democrat leaning, but not all. And those states represent about 209 electoral votes. And it's pending in another group of states that represent 50 additional electoral votes. So almost 50% is being represented. We're very close. What are your thoughts on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact?
I think it's a good idea. And more than 20 states have already approached this, and I think more will. I think we've been in a period of great struggle, perplexity, volatility, and uncertainty, really. The election of 2000 was eventually decided by the Supreme Court 5-4 along partisan lines when Al Gore lost to George W. Bush. The popular vote recount in Florida was stopped. People take advantage of the loopholes or the imprecisions of our system to do mischief. If we had, let me say this slightly differently. After the Watergate debacle, the Congress of the United States passed a number of laws to prevent the same sets of abuses from occurring again. After January 6th, the Congress only passed this one fairly limited certification law. We might have expected new guardrails to be put up to prevent that sort of chaos from occurring. Every historian of constitutions and republics agrees on this, that peaceful transfer of power is the very basis of a Republican culture, that without peaceful transfer of power, you are headed towards either chaos or autocracy, or first one, then the other. This is not okay, and we need to clarify it, and we could clarify it. And really, I go back to Jefferson's view, David, that it's time for a wholesale constitutional revision. And one of the first things we need to address is the problem of the popular vote and the Electoral College and the capacity of individual states to meddle with an election after the people have already voted. This is a fundamental and ongoing issue in American life, and it could be solved by a rational people. Most people that I talk with are terrified by the idea of a new constitutional convention. I am not. I think it's vitally needed. We need to address the Electoral College. We need to address the certification process. We need to address the emoluments clause. We need to address the pardon clause. We need to address the impeachment clause. We need to really wrestle with the problem of the 2 senators for every state, irrespective of their population. These are things that a free and democratic people should be able to accomplish, even in an age of television, social media, and intense lobbying by outside forces. It can be done to make every district as fair as it is possible to be. That would change the system instantly, my friend.
I think it's so complicated because everybody fears giving up an advantage or giving an advantage to the other side. The art of compromise is one of the central points of a democracy, of a representative republic, of a nation moving forward. Do you think the art of compromise is possible in the 21st century? And how would a constitutional convention look in your mind?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this, and you and I should really talk about it because you understand the algorithmic side in a way that I don't. There were 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. It would be easy enough in our time to create a modeling system, a sampling system, to produce a kind of a jury pool of electors. So that's possible, and I think that it's just unconscionable that we're still living under a constitution that was written by white men in wigs and buckles. Secondly, we could sequester them in Vail, Colorado, or somewhere in the deserts of Utah for a month. We could have constitutional scholars come in and give lectures for a week on every possible aspect of this and every possible principle behind all of this. And then the people would deliberate. Now, I know there are many, many, many ways that this could go wrong, but can we really continue to operate under the system that we have? Do we really want presidents pardoning their cronies? Do we really want presidents taking emoluments that we can't get any legal teeth at? We have an impeachment clause that has been invoked 4 times for the presidency and never successfully. I mean, clearly, there are just fundamental problems of this Constitution. And what we learn, and this is where Jefferson was so right, David, is that no reform comes from within. As you say, people don't want to lose or they don't want the other side to win. And so we're not going to be able to reform the system from within. We're going to have to break out and look at it reasonably from the outside in and make those repairs. And of course that's dangerous. Who knows what would happen. But if we don't do that, we're stuck. And I'm going to be interviewing a friend of mine named Edward Watts from the University of California, San Diego, who's an expert on the Roman Republic. And one of the points he makes is that the Roman Republic had a constitution designed for a city-state, but by the time of, say, the birth of Christ or the time of Julius Caesar, Rome was an empire. And so an empire was trying to govern itself with a constitution that really fitted a city-state. And necessarily, therefore, it broke down. We are a world empire, a nation of 1/3 of a billion people, with almost unbelievable economic and regional diversities, trying to govern itself with an instrument produced by James Madison at a time when the population of the country was 4 million, and women, African Americans, Native Americans, etc., were not even counted as legitimate voices in a republic. And so, yes, it would be difficult, but it's something that we should do. The day is coming when Texas is going to go blue, and when Texas goes blue, who will be demanding constitutional reform? It will be the Republicans. And that just brings up one other point. We know we need to let Puerto Rico become a state, and we've known for a long time that the District of Columbia needs to have statehood. If they were certainly going to be Republican in their political nature, the Republican Party would be demanding this. But because we almost certainly understand that they would be Democratic in their political orientation, the Republicans oppose it. If Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. would be Republican, the Democrats would oppose it. In other words, there's just so much political self-protection and hypocrisy in our system that there are times when it makes you literally sick to your stomach.
How do we begin? How do the listeners of this program move forward to begin this process?
Well, first of all, I'm sure that many people listening, David, have been shaking their heads like, are you kidding? A constitutional convention? What a blah, blah, blah nightmare that would be. I hear this all the time when I talk about it. I think I just ask people to step back and think about it and ask yourself some questions about the legitimacy of our Constitution, not only from the people that created it, but from the 3/5 clause and so on, about the problems of the Constitution that become more and more and more glaring every election cycle. I think if people really stop to think about it, they might be more positive in their view of this. And think about Canada. Canada, a generation ago, had a constitutional convention. All hell didn't break loose, although, of course, they're Canadians and we're not. But they did it, and they have a better constitution today because of that, in addition to which they solved several fundamental problems of Canadian life, which was the relationship of the provinces to the national government, and especially the unique status of Quebec as a French-speaking semi-sovereign province. The second thing they were able to address, David, was their relation with Indigenous people, and they made great strides forward in respect for and protection of the sovereignty of the Indigenous people of Canada. So, in other words, it can be done. It's not an impossibility. It's just something that we fear. We're stuck in this kind of deeply divided moment where everyone is paranoid about losing more control or yielding control to the other faction or the other party. And so we truly are stuck. So it would take a people's movement to force this. But such things do happen.
And I think that's a good point for us to maybe pause the conversation for now, but something we need to revisit in the coming weeks, months, and years as we move towards the 250th birthday of this great country. Thank you so much for your insight and for your thoughts on this, because I think people wrestle with this, especially as we go through challenging political times. Where are we? Why are we here? And where do we go from here? And trying to shine a light in that darkness makes all the difference.
No, I couldn't agree more, David. I thank you for being the guest host today. I'll just say this much by way of closing. I'm terribly worried about the future of the United States, and not just because of the election. And secondly, I think the greatest gift we could give to ourselves as we celebrate our 250th birthday is either a new constitution or a mock constitutional convention that doesn't have any binding legal force, but nevertheless would be an exercise in how it can be done and should be done. And then the results of that would be presented to the country as the humanities gift to the 250th birthday of the United States. I think that's going to be much more interesting than giant flags and fireworks and the culture wars that are going to be fought with enormous verbal violence. So let's do it. Let's either have a mock constitutional convention or an actual constitutional convention. That's what a great nation would do when it reaches a quarter of a millennium in its existence.
Thank you, my friend. This has been a great conversation as always. It's so good to spend time with you. This has been Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson.